Jeff, stand by. You know, Don, it's very clear that what the president wanted to do was send a powerful message not only to the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, but to a whole bunch of other folks in the region as well, and beyond the region, including the Russians.
Absolutely, and officials are saying this is a last of it until another decision is made, and that a decision can possibly be made. So let's go to the ground here and talk about what this means in Syria and also what it means for foreign policy. I'm going to bring in Major General James Spider Marks-Wolf, and I also want to bring in Fareed Zakaria as well. So General Marks, more than 50 Tomahawk missiles have been launched tonight, targeting a taxiway, aircraft, fuel points. What's your reaction? Because as I understand, the president was presented with 3 options from his team, and he went with Tomahawk missiles.
Well, I think what the president was given was a very narrowly scoped requirement and then options to go after that very narrowly defined mission statement. Mm-hmm. This is retaliatory in nature, and it's very proportional. So what Secretary Mattis, I'm certain, and General Dunford and General McMaster came forward, and they were all together. They linked arms on this thing. I'm certain there was no dissension among those gentlemen. And they said, look, Mr. President, we need to go after Assad's ability to deliver weapons of mass destruction. That's chemical weapons. He's done this from this airfield. Let's keep it very narrowly scoped. We're not trying to boil the ocean. We're not trying to conduct a regime change. We're not trying to eliminate all of his military capabilities. This is simply a very narrowly defined mission.
Is this to send a message? This is to send.
I would say that the political objectives were met. We care. We're going to act, and we're going to act with impunity. We're going to notify our allies. We didn't ask permission. We notified our allies, and we told Russia, oh, by the way, guess what we just did? We just launched some T-LAMs toward some targets in Syria. I mean, I'm sure that's what the communication was. Not in time for Russia to do anything to alert Assad. Mm-hmm. I'm certain they said those T-LAMs are away, but we're letting you guys know. Yeah. And I'm also, I don't know for sure, but I would imagine that Assad, in advance of this, scrambled his aircraft, his fixed-wing aircraft, and got him off the runway. So we achieved our objectives to act. We did not degrade in any substantial way Assad's ability to execute missions like this again.
When you look at the video, the first video coming in just about 15, 20 minutes ago, when you look at the video, what does this tell you? What is happening here, General?
What that tells me is the Navy's doing its job. Mm-hmm. Those are Tomahawks being launched from incredibly talented sailors and leaders aboard ships in the Mediterranean. That's what they do for a living. What I'm interested in is what does the effect of that T-LAM on the other end look like in Shirot, the airfield. I want to see what the battle damage assessment is. We know those things were launched. We know they're incredibly precise. I'd like to see, and we will, through intelligence collection, we'll start to get images that the Syrians will send out in social media, but we'll also start to be able to compare those against intelligence collection that tells us very precisely what we achieved.
As we know, Fareed, the president did not want to go into Syria. He has said as much years ago, even 48 hours ago. It appears that this is a change in strategy and a change in policy, and very quickly.
Well, it's a change in policy. I'm not sure it's a change in strategy, because the president seems to have said that, you know, this was a retaliation, that this was tied to Assad's chemical weapons use. But Secretary Tillerson has briefed reporters saying, we're not changing our strategy on Syria. We're not, you know, this is a one-off, as it were. So this is almost an expression of moral outrage. And who can quarrel with that? I mean, Assad is a horrible dictator. What he did was ghastly. The fact that we can in some way, you know, show that, make him pay some kind of a price for it, you know, it makes us all feel that the United States is in some sense affirming its role as a moral leader. But, you know, military strategist Samuel Huntington used to say, military force is not a good instrument of communication. It is an instrument of compellence. You have to have something you are trying to get the other side to do, a political strategy that you're using the force for. What is our political strategy? There is a civil war in Iraq between Assad essentially and ISIS and a bunch of other jihadis. Are we now saying we're against Assad? Or do we want to strengthen ISIS? Do we want Assad, the Assad regime to fall? If so, are we willing to commit ourselves to that goal? If not, we've just thrown bombs in the middle of one of the most complex civil wars in the country, and now we're going to step back and say, well, that's it, we're done.
And the reason it's hard to answer many of the questions that you're asking is because this is such a young presidency, and we really don't know what the foreign policy is, especially when it comes to Syria.
Well, and there is this bizarre incoherence at this point, right? As you say, there are 24 tweets that Donald Trump made in 2013 when there were worse chemical attacks than this one, in which he said, do not get involved in Syria, do not bomb Syria, this would be a big mistake. Sean Spicer said 2 days ago, reacting to this very chemical attack, we shouldn't be trying to get Assad out, that's not realistic. So if that's the case, what have we just done? And what is the purpose of it? And what will we do tomorrow? You know, so I say there's a tremendous feel-good, and I don't mean that in a superficial sense. There is a kind of morally affirming element to this act, this military act, that I applaud. But what is the political strategy behind it? Are we now going to try and topple the Assad government? If so, that means tens of thousands of troops on the ground. If not, what exactly have we achieved? There is a danger, Ben Wiedemann mentioned it on Anderson, there's a danger that we have effectively acted as ISIS's air force, because anything that weakens Assad in a strategic sense in Syria strengthens ISIS. Those are the two principal players on the ground.
And that is really the dilemma here, what happens with ISIS as it comes to this. Stand by, gentlemen. We're going to need you throughout the evening. I'm going to get back to my colleague, Wolf Blitzer, who has some experts with him as well. Wolf, what do you have?
Yeah, very, very dramatic and important developments unfolding on this night, Don. I want to bring in General Mark Hertley and Admiral John Kirby, two of our analysts. General Hertley, you've planned strikes like these before, these Tomahawk cruise missiles coming off these ships in the Mediterranean, launching these strikes. Obviously, no pilots involved, so if the Syrians do have a good air defense system, there's not going to be any U.S. casualties. But tell us about the mission and the target.
Well, the mission was obviously, Secretary Mattis probably presented several courses of action after discussion with General Votel and others in the area, saying, this is what the president wants to do, give us a couple of courses of action to take back to him. They probably took him at least 2, probably 4, and the president picked which one he wanted to do. And as we've seen, Wolf, it was a very bold tactical strike. But again, you have to consider what is going to be the operational and the strategic objective. One of the things that I just listening to Don and Spider and Fareed talk about, specifically they talk about the advancement of the political dynamic. What are we trying to achieve? It's one of the 3 Ps. There's the political piece, there is certainly the psychological piece, because when they wake up in the morning, you know, both in Syria and in Russia, they're going to say, holy smokes, America, the United States is now involved in this. But then there's also the physical piece. What destruction actually occurred at that air base? It sends a message not only in what was destroyed, but the very fact that we have entered this war. But there's going to be a new mindset in a whole bunch of people, not only in Syria, but in other nations like Iran and Russia, and many other countries in the Middle East in terms of what occurred tonight.
How do you expect Bashar al-Assad, General Hertling, to respond in terms of what he's going to do, shift things on the ground, continue these kinds of strikes that he's launched against his own people?
He will know not to launch another chemical strike, that's for sure. I don't think we expect to see that happening anytime soon. So from that perspective, this bold tactical strike will probably be successful. Now, how does it affect his continued operation against people in Idlib province and in other areas of Syria? I don't know, Wolf. I think he will probably continue fighting this mission. But as we've talked about before, Mr. Assad was on his heels about a year plus ago. When Russia came to his aid, not only with artillery and advisors and assisters, but primarily air power, he was able to turn the tide and start defeating the rebels that were trying to oust him from power. It was critical, the fact that Russia came to his aid. So what will happen now, not only from the standpoint of what decisions will Mr. Assad make, but what decisions will Mr. Putin make? And not only will it affect him in Syria, but it may affect him in other places of the world like Ukraine and in other parts of Europe. We've got to consider all those things. And then there's also that additional effect of how will Iran react to this, because there were not only Russian advisors throughout Syria, but there have been many Hezbollah forces helping the Syrians in their fight against the rebels, and I think they may be affected by this as well.
Yeah, the Iranians support the Hezbollah militias that are in Syria right now supporting Bashar al-Assad, and there's no doubt plenty of those Iranian Revolutionary Guard advisors as well. Admiral Kirby, you bring unique perspective. You were the spokesman at the Pentagon, later at the State Department. The Secretary of State Tillerson says Moscow failed to rid Syria of its chemical weapons under that 2013 agreement that had been reached during the Obama administration. He said this, and I'll read it to you. Clearly, Russia has failed in its responsibility to deliver on that commitment. Either Russia has been complicit or Russia has been incompetent in its ability to deliver. The U.S. did not respond militarily in 2013, as you remember, Admiral Kirby, because the Russians promised to make sure all of Syria's stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction, poison gas, sarin gas, chemical weapons would be destroyed. Clearly, they were not.
Well, we got 99%, I think it was, of the declared stockpiles, and even the OPCW was able to affirm that of the declared stockpiles, we know we got the vast majority. But even at the time, we said, and I'm pretty sure OPCW said, we couldn't rule out the fact that there were undeclared stockpiles that they still had. In either way, and I don't disagree with Secretary Tillerson, but I would broaden it to say that Russia's complicit in a whole lot more than just the potential failure to get chemical weapons out of Syria. They have basically propped up Assad. They have made the gains that he has made over the last 2 years possible, quite frankly. And I do think it's going to be important to see how they react to this, both in rhetoric but also in action going forward. I also agree and disagree with Secretary Tillerson on two things. He said it's not a small strike. I agree. There's nothing small about what we did tonight. Nothing. It does change the situation on the ground. And to say that we're not, we can just guarantee that it's a one-off, that we're not going to potentially have to do more kinetic military action here, I think it's too early to say that. And I think we're in now. We are in. And when I listened to the president talk tonight, I took away a different tone from him than when I saw Secretary Tillerson's comments. I took away from the president that he is now putting his thumb on the scale in this civil war, whether he likes it or not. We've done that, and I think we're going to have to see how that plays out now in the future.
One thing that's pretty extraordinary, the U.S., we're told, U.S. officials tell us that the U.S. military, Admiral Kirby, had multiple conversations with the Russian military today, throughout the day, in fact. I can only assume that whatever the U.S. told the Russians would then pass along to the Syrians and tell the Syrians, you better get your jets in some sort of bunker because the U.S. is about to launch some sort of strike.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to find out if the Pentagon reveals sort of how much deconfliction conversations they were over what period of time, how detailed they were. I'm not at all surprised that they used that channel to have that kind of discussion, because they have an obligation that they take seriously to reduce and minimize civilian casualties. We obviously didn't want to hit Russian targets, so I think I applaud that effort. It makes sense that they would use it. I'm also not surprised at all that there was no government-to-government communications between Washington and Moscow at a higher level about what we were going to do. I think this played out probably the best way it could. Obviously, there were Russian forces at this base, and as I understand it, there's Russian aircraft at that base. It'll be interesting to see if any of those Russian aircraft were hit as a result of being there. So we'll have to see how this plays out. But again, I think this is why you have a deconfliction channel, and it looks to me like it was used appropriately in this case.
Do we know, does anyone know if there were any back channel alerts given to Iran? Because the Iranians, as you know, Admiral Kirby, they got plenty of forces in Syria as well, working with Bashar al-Assad's regime.
Yeah, they do. People I've talked to this evening haven't indicated that there was deconfliction with Iran. Now, there's also no existing deconfliction channel with the government of Iran or Iranian forces. And these aren't Iranian state forces. This is a Republican Guard that's there and Hezbollah. So I doubt seriously that there was any deconfliction with Iran. And nobody I've talked to tonight seems to indicate that would have been the case.
Let me read the statement we just got in from Senator Ted Cruz on Syria. I'll read the entire thing, then we'll discuss. Today, after 8 years of Obama foreign policy failures, Syria is a humanitarian disaster. Bashar al-Assad is a monster, a puppet of Russia and Iran, and he has once again used chemical weapons against his own citizens, murdering innocent men, women, and children. Senator Cruz's statement goes on. Any military action in Syria must be justified as protecting the vital national security interests of America, including decisive action to prevent chemical weapons from falling into the hands of radical Islamic terrorists. And I look forward to our Commander-in-Chief making the case to Congress and the American people how we should do so in the days ahead. A very strong statement, Admiral Kirby, from Senator Cruz. You know, a lot of lawmakers, they wanted the passage of authorization for the use of military force before the U.S. once again got involved militarily, whether in Syria, Iraq, any place else. Clearly, there was no legislation, no formal congressional authorization for the launching of these Tomahawk cruise missiles. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, the AUMF that exists is based on 2001, which authorized the use of military force against al-Qaeda. Now, we have been using that in the last several years to go after ISIS as a sort of an al-Qaeda affiliate, so it's still valid. We have argued, or at least the Obama administration argued, for a new authorization for use of military force. We weren't able to get that done. I think authorities from Congress are important in this regard, and I'm sure they're going to work that out. It was interesting, but this is the point I really wanted to get to. In Senator Cruz's statement, and when you listen to the president's statement, both of them talked about this being in the vital national security interests of the country in terms of dealing with weapons of mass destruction, the proliferation and distribution and use of them. I think that was very deliberately inserted into the president's remarks, very deliberately inserted into the senator's remarks to convey that even though we didn't have a technical AUMF for tonight's action, that it was in the vital national security interests of the United States to conduct this sort of a strike against a WMD capability. It does beg the question, though, about going forward. And you caught a little bit of that in Senator Cruz's statement, but I was thinking the same thing when I heard the president, that if it is, in fact, a vital national security interest, and I believe it is, to prevent the spread of WMD and to use these kinds of weapons, then it does beg the question or the possibility that these kinds of strikes will probably or could happen again in the future.
A good point. AUMF authorization for the use of military force. That's the legislation many lawmakers would like to see passed before the U.S. once again gets involved in military action along these lines. A very initial step. We'll see what happens in the days to come. Let's go back to Don for more.
All right, Wolf, thank you very much. We'll get back to Wolf in just a little bit. And again, the video you're looking at, the first video of U.S. military strikes in Syria tonight. Let's get to the politics of all this. I want to bring in my colleague, White House correspondent Jim Acosta. Jim, I understand that you've been talking to the White House, to White House officials just now. What are they telling you? What's the latest?
Well, I talked to one senior administration official, Don, about whether we should be expecting any future airstrikes in the coming days going after Bashar al-Assad's chemical weapons capabilities. And according to this one senior administration official, this person did not want to get ahead of any presidential decisions that may be forthcoming. But this official said that the president very clearly tonight, quote, laid down a marker for the Assad government that it should cease using chemical weapons against its civilians or risk inviting another strike by the United States. It's a very clear message that the White House is trying to send tonight. And keep in mind, Don, the National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, when he was briefing reporters here earlier this evening, he very clearly said to reporters that no, that this strike tonight did not eliminate Bashar al-Assad's chemical weapons capabilities and that those chemical weapons capabilities still exist. And so what the president is hoping tonight, from what I'm hearing from talking to top officials, is that he has laid down a marker to the Assad government that this has to stop, no more chemical weapons attacks, or there are going to be future consequences. And this official went on to say, sort of underlining the point, that the response from the international community has been, quote, extraordinarily positive. So the thought being inside the White House, I think at this point, Don, is that yes, that tonight's airstrikes against these chemical weapons capabilities in Syria were successful, but at the same time, they feel like they have the international backing from the global community. If Bashar al-Assad strikes his people again with chemical weapons, that the U.S. is going to have essentially the backing of the global community to go ahead and do this again if it's necessary. Don?
A fair amount of positive backing here at home as well. Jim Acosta down in Florida. Jim, thank you very much. I want to bring back Fareed Zakaria now and General Marks. Also, CNN's Jamie Gangel joins us. Jamie, I understand that you have been speaking with your sources in Washington. Why did the president attack after saying that he did not want to become involved in Syria?
So everybody I've spoken to has said that this was a very personal reaction, that he saw those pictures obviously just a few days ago. As Fareed's been saying, he had a completely different policy. This was a dramatic shift, but also that he wanted to send a message, and that this was the kind of aggressive move he is prepared to make. One of the sources said to me, he wants to send a message that he will use military power, and he wanted that message also to go to North Korea and Iran. In other words, when provoked, he's willing to do something.
I want to, Fareed, because Jim Acosta talked about international backing and international support. I want to read this. This is from a spokesperson for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he says, in both word and action, President Trump sent a strong and clear message today that the use and spread of chemical weapons will not be tolerated. Israel fully supports President Trump's decision and hopes that this message of resolve in the face of Assad's regime, horrific actions will resonate not only in Damascus but in Tehran, Pyongyang, and elsewhere. What do you make of it?
Oh, I think more than just Israel. I think the Trump administration will get broad international support for what it's done, partly because, as Spider's been pointing out, it's fairly narrowly targeted. There isn't a danger of this turning into something larger and snowballing. But look, the Assad regime is a brutal, thuggish regime, and people have been trying to figure out some way to get its attention, to get it to, maybe adhere to some red lines. And, the big hope is, and Secretary Tillerson talked about this, to get the Assad regime to Geneva to talk about a political transition in Syria. The only hope for the end of violence in Syria is for some kind of political deal. Assad is not going to be able to rule the whole country, but his opponents are not going to be able to rule the whole country. So somebody has to share power. There will have to be either a partition or some kind of power-sharing deal. So everyone is going to look at this and hope that it maybe moves the ball forward.
But what will be the timeline to know if Assad continues to be a bad actor? What is the timeline here? We know chemical weapons, the president is saying, off limits, but does Assad still stay in place?
Oh, yeah.
We go back to the Obama administration?
The timeline is just what it's always been. This really is, in many ways, in that larger strategic picture that you're asking, Don, this is a one-off because it doesn't degrade Assad's military capacity. Remember, he kills thousands and thousands of children with bombs, barrel bombs, and bullets. He kills lots of people to maintain his control. All that stays. He continues to try to maintain his part of Syria. ISIS is trying to maintain its part. Al-Qaeda is involved. Al-Nusra is involved. That 50-sided civil war continues. I don't think this has changed very much of anything other than maybe this red line about chemical weapons.
This was not about degrading Syria's capabilities, right? This was sending a message, as we have spoken about. But just to be clear, he did not seek the approval of any nation internationally.
No.
He simply notified.
Notification, and we're looking, the United States is looking for buy-in. So you pick up the phone and you talk to those folks that you're most interested in getting their support, and you say, this is what we're going to do, I'm letting you know. And then we also did that with Russia, just to inform them as well, to put their heads down.
Why the change now since 2013? I'll ask you, then I'll ask Fareed as well. Why this change? Was it the pictures? He was affected by these 70 so people who were killed in this, including children and babies. Why now? Because as Fareed said, hundreds of people are killed by barrel bombs and other.
All the time. Syria is guilty of immense acts of brutality that are horrendous, and they have been doing that for years. It has to do with context. Look what happened in 2013. President Obama was looking at 2013. We had just been able to get out of Iraq. Whether that was a good decision or not, we did. And we were also looking at that point, we were starting to, we had ramped up our presence in Afghanistan, and we were now trying to figure out how do we achieve a similar type of withdrawal or a normalcy in Afghanistan that we could sustain. And now we have this challenge in Syria, and I'm sure the president's calculation was, This is horrendous, but I can't afford to do this right now for whatever motivated him. I'm sure there were political motivations. I'm sure there were domestic motivations. There always are. Fast forward now, we have a new president, more bellicose in his speech. He's not dealing with those issues. This is his problem. President Obama is history.
It's certainly now with this. It's his.
And I hope, I pray that every issue that this administration sees right now, they will embrace as their own. You know, you embrace the chaos. You got to lean into the storm if you're going to have this. You got to weather the storm and get through it. It's yours.
It certainly is interesting because now we're talking about this, but it doesn't completely take Russia off the table, because how will Russia react to this? How do they fit into this entire thing? Because we said we have ISIS on the table, but also Russia is also complicit in what's happening in Syria.
And Iran. This is one of the most complicated international crises I've ever seen in my life, because you have many, many actors internally. You know, the CIA has estimated 1,000 different militias in Syria, but then you have many outside powers supporting various ones of these. But the core issue, I think, in terms of, to answer your question, Don, which is a really good one, because there are very few issues on which Donald Trump has been as consistent as he was on non-intervention in Syria. And I think what happened is, a lot of what Spider said, I think Donald Trump thinks of himself as a tough guy. He confronted this issue, and his reflex was, I'm going to do something tough. And in this particular case, I think it's morally admirable that he wanted to do it. The danger here is, what if this doesn't change much on the ground? What if, in a sense, a few months from now, we're looking at the same Syrian civil war, and Assad is emboldened and empowered and defiant? Then, has the United States been humiliated? How will Donald Trump react to that idea? You know, this was one of the things that always dragged America further and further in foreign engagements, which is you commit a certain amount of American prestige, power, and credibility, and it doesn't work. Now, do you back down, or do you throw good money after bad?
I want to add two names to that scenario, and that is General Mattis and H.R. McMaster. President Trump decided he wanted to do this, but he didn't make the decision alone. Those two men weighed in, and they approved this. And there may be a question about what comes next, what comes tomorrow, you know, what kind of influence with Russia. But those are two experienced military men who said to him they thought this was okay.
I think that's, as Spider's been pointing out, they took his impulse and they translated it into a very narrow, limited, targeted policy, which is tactically very effective as a result.
Yeah.
One airfield, one set of strikes, you're in and you're out, and it's over.
But I've got to ask this, Jamie, since you've been speaking to folks in Washington, just on the political side, right? His advisors know that this changes the narrative from what had been, the news had been about him.
Right, so let's be realistic for a moment. I was here tonight because we were supposed to be talking about palace intrigue and what was going on in the White House and who was up and who was down, and is Steve Bannon out of power now, and is Jared Kushner. That seems, you know, prosaic in comparison to trivial in comparison to what's going on now, but it does. This does change the discussion, and it's going to change it for several more days.
Yes.
And I hope it changes the man. I hope that one thing that this does is make Donald Trump realize he's president of the United States, he's leader of the world. He should put away the Twitter app. He should recognize that he is making decisions about war and peace, take them as seriously as he can, do the best he can, and, you know, enough with the antics, enough with the social media.
I love that. I don't think Twitter is going away. And actually, I was thinking, I wonder what the first tweet will be.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, will he suddenly realize the gravity of the position that he's in now because of all of this and put down Twitter? But we'll see. Maybe it does change the man. But, you know, as we've been talking about, it changes the narrative. But as my colleague Wolf Blitzer knows in Washington, it all gets back to politics very quickly. But this is certainly very serious military operation underway right now, Wolf.
59 Tomahawk cruise missiles targeting this Syrian air base. I want to bring in Rear Admiral John Kirby once again, retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. Also joining us, retired Lieutenant Colonel Rick Francona. And Rick, you've been to this air base, the El Shayrat air base in Syria. You were a former U.S. military attaché in Syria. Tell us a little bit about this base.
Well, it's not one of their larger air bases. It's pretty utilitarian, kind of bare bones. It's got basically 2 runways, 2 squadron areas, and they have 2 squadrons of aircraft there, Sukhoi 22s. This is an older, reliable Russian air-to-ground bomber. It's the backbone of the Syrian air-to-ground effort. They've got a lot of them, and they fly them every day. And this base here is a very nice, it's a very great location because they can get from this base up into that Idlib province where much of the fighting is going on now. You know, after the fall of Aleppo, almost all of the bombing shifted to the southwest of Aleppo into that Idlib province. So this is a very centrally located base. It doesn't surprise me at all that this was the base used to launch this attack the other day. So you've got 2 squadrons there, and also your administrative area, refueling area, armament area, and all that. It's kind of isolated. There are only a couple of small towns around it, so the chances of civilian casualties in like a neighboring city would be very, very minimized. So it was a good target to pick, and as I said, it's not very big. 59 Tomahawks will definitely make an impact.
They certainly will, from 2 U.S. ships in the eastern Mediterranean. The statement put out by the Pentagon, Colonel Francona, from the Pentagon spokesman, Captain Jeff Davis, among other things, says this: Russian forces were notified in advance of the strike using the established deconfliction line. U.S. military planners took precautions to minimize risk to Russian or Syrian personnel located at the airfield. So that basically means what? The Syrians and the Russians at that air base were told, go into bunkers because U.S. cruise missiles are on the way?
I don't know what the timeline was. I don't know how much advance notice they got. I know that we have often conducted these strikes at night just to minimize the number of casualties. We want to blow up things and facilities, not necessarily kill people. So I think that was probably the thinking behind that. But you know, all the aircraft should have been stored in these hardened aircraft shelters. Each squadron area has enough shelters to store their 12 aircraft. And if they're in those hardened aircraft shelters, it would take more than 1 Tomahawk to take out those shelters. But you know, as the Admiral has said before, these are very precise weapons, and it's not inconceivable that you could put 1, 2, 3 Tomahawks into one of these shelters and obliterate what's inside. So all in all, I think this was a good target to hit. 59 Tomahawks sounds about right, and I think it sends the right message, but without risking a lot of collateral damage.
Admiral Kirby, they said in the Pentagon statement that the 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles targeted aircraft, hardened aircraft shelters, petroleum and logistical storage, as well as ammunition supply bunkers, air defense systems, and radars. If they hit all of that, it would have been a pretty successful operation, right?
Oh, without question. And my guess is if that's what they were targeting, and they used nearly 60 Tomahawks to launch these strikes, that they probably hit all that stuff, and therefore can say, I think, truthfully, that they very much had a degradation effect on the Syrian Air Force, particularly, well, especially at that base. But that's a significant set of targets and a significant number of missiles to go get it.
And let me bring in our other military analyst who's with us, General Hertling. The statement also said, and it's very significant, the statement says this air base, the El Shayrat airfield, was used to store chemical weapons and Syrian air forces. So the U.S., and this is where the chemical weapons attack that killed all those civilians, including a lot of children, it was launched, the Syrian fighter jets launched from this specific air base. But if the U.S. knew there were still chemical weapons there, storage of chemical weapons, this was clearly, once again, a violation of what the Russians had promised in 2013, that the Syrians would destroy all their chemical weapons capabilities.
Well, it's not only a violation of that, Wolf, it's also a violation of international law. There's a chemical warfare prevention requirement of all nations that are signatories of the Geneva Convention. So just knowing that this was there and knowing that it was going to be used is not only a bane on the Syrian military and government, but also, as stated in the statements, against Russia's too. One of the things, if I can go back to the question you asked both Rick and John, the comment about the precision of the strikes, 59 or 60 Tomahawk missiles targeting facilities, targeting hardened shelters, not targeting people, and in fact being given warnings either informally or in a nuanced way to both Syrian and Russian government. Juxtapose that against what has been happening not only with the Syrian military dropping arbitrarily barrel bombs and dumb bombs on civilian populations, but also the support they've received from the Russian military in doing the same thing. That's arbitrary killing of anybody who happens to be in the battle space. And it goes to that way of war versus the American way of war to try and denigrate the capabilities of the enemy force versus just targeting innocent civilians. So I think that's an important point to be made too as well.
It certainly is. Everybody stand by for a moment. I want to go back to Don. And Don, as I go back to you, the statement from the Pentagon also said initial indications are that this strike, these 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles, this strike has severely damaged or destroyed Syrian aircraft and support infrastructure and equipment at this El Shirat airfield, reducing the Syrian government's ability, the statement says, to deliver chemical weapons. The final sentence in the statement is significant. The use of chemical weapons against innocent people will not be tolerated.
And as the sun comes up, we'll get more pictures, and we'll see there's that statement that Wolf was reading right there on the air from Jeff Davis, a Pentagon spokesperson. We'll get back to Wolf in just a little bit. Wolf, thanks. I want to bring in now Jill Doherty, a former CNN Moscow bureau chief. She joins us now by phone. I understand you have some news for us. You got reaction to the U.S. strike from a Russian official tonight. What can you tell us, Jill?
Don, it's not a real reaction yet. They're obviously formulating what they're going to say. I did contact Maria Zakharova, who is the spokesperson for the foreign ministry, and she said there will be a response. Right now, I've been monitoring Russian media, Russian television. There's actually now beginning quite a lot of coverage with some video, lots of quotes coming from President Trump. Interestingly, in some of the reports, the more, let's say, detailed ones, they're paying a lot of attention to the justification for this action. President Trump saying it was in the vital national security interests of the United States, and also paying a lot of attention to the significance of chemical weapons and defending the United States. Now, if you would normally think how the Russians would respond to something like this, they would definitely not condone any unilateral action whatsoever. And they're not directly saying that yet, but they're beginning now to quote the Syrian media as saying, well, the United States didn't get approval from the United Nations, etc. Also, you know, President Putin traditionally would not condone any action against Assad. Not because that they particularly like him at all, but they believe that he's the elected president. So it's an interesting kind of morphing right now and getting their position. I would point out just one other thing. Quotes from the spokesperson for President Putin, Dmitry Peskov, an interview that was done before these attacks. But he said, saying to AP, Russian support for Assad is not unconditional. Moscow can't make Assad follow its orders. And that would seem to be an answer to some of the statements by Secretary Tillerson saying, you know, essentially that Russia can influence Assad and should, and if it's not, it's complicit. So I think we're going to see a more formulated response pretty soon from the Kremlin, but that's what we've got right now.
Hey, Jill, I want to ask you, because the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, clarified some information for us yesterday and said the U.S., about the U.S. being in contact with the Russians, says no contacts were made with Moscow with President Putin. He said, but U.S. military did make contact with Russian military officials in accordance with deconfliction agreements in Syria. So we know that there were some Russians at the base and that the U.S. notified Russia ahead of this military action, Jill.
Well, the way they notified, I think, is important. They did not, at least as far as we know, contact directly President Putin or the Kremlin in a kind of political way to say we are going to do this.
So why would Russian forces still be there, Jill?
Well, the Russian forces, it depends on how many there were, but they have been at air bases because, after all, when they carry out air attacks, they've been working with the Syrian Air Force. So there could have been, and apparently were, some Russians there. I'd want to know how many and what their jobs were. But the way, again, that the United States apparently informed them was through the channels that we've got right now, which is deconfliction, as it's called, with the Russians. It's a more, let's say, hands-on, on-the-ground type of notification that, you know, something's going to happen and we don't want to hit you. Yeah. Barbara would know more about that than I do, but this is not a high-level political, you know, Trump calling Putin type of notice, and that's very important to point out.
Jill, I want you to stick with us because also Major General James Spider Marks would know about that. So, General, if the chemical weapons were launched from this same base, did the Russians know about that? Were they complicit in this?
I am certain that the Russians were complicit. I would state with confidence, yes. They didn't give authorization, but they knew about it. Mm-hmm. If they are at the air base that we just struck, I can guarantee you that those capabilities that Russia has there probably are air defense and maintenance. And in and about their daily business, as Syrian aircraft are uploading chemical weapons, they are aware and they're doing their jobs and they're kind of intermingling. So the short answer is yes.
So Jill, you said this wasn't an official reaction. When might we have an official reaction from Russia, Jill Doherty?
Well, it's always a question. You never know. But this spokesperson definitely said there will be. And I'm sure they want to formulate things as already, you know, it's 8 hours ahead of Eastern time, so morning will be coming, and they're going to have some type of response.
Yeah, well, the Secretary of State said, Jill, that our target in this attack was not Russia, it was not the Russians. Our target was the airfield and the Syrian regime. Could there be a retaliatory attack on the U.S.?
By whom? By Russians?
By Russia or by Syria?
Well, by Syria, yes, I presume in one way or another, but what kind of attack and where? I mean, you'd have to figure where American troops or what could they do, let's say. But I don't think that they're going to want to do something that's very overt because they could be knocked out very quickly by U.S. forces if need be. There may be other ways of retaliating. I don't, at this point, think that the Russians would retaliate. I think we're going to see more political action, diplomatic action, perhaps criticism for unilateral action. But again, you know, there's really no love lost between Putin and Assad. They know that he's a problem. But the only thing is, they support him for a variety of other reasons. And so I think it's going to be a nuanced response that we have to watch very carefully.
Mm-hmm. Jill Doherty, stand by. Thank you very much. We'll be getting back to Jill. Our breaking news tonight, President Trump launches a military strike on a Syrian government target in retaliation for their chemical weapons attack on civilians earlier this week. CNN's senior international correspondent is Ben Wiedemann. He is live for us on the Syrian border. We can see the sun is coming up, Ben, so good morning to you there. You are there on that border. It's daylight now. What's the reaction?
Well, the reaction, I mean, what we've heard from the Syrian media, we've been reporting on, no reaction from those people who have borne the brunt of the aggression by the Syrian regime now for well over 6 years. But it's important to keep in mind when looking at the situation in Syria that the vast number of the victims of this regime, more than 400,000, they were killed by the regime, not by ISIS. And therefore, many Syrians will be happy to see some sort of punishment given to the Syrian regime. Even though at the moment, until just a few days ago, our focus, at least as journalists here and in Iraq, was very much on ISIS. And of course, the worry is that with a weakened Syrian regime, there may be a vacuum into which, of course, ISIS will rush, which has always been the case in this area when it comes to the weakening of an old regime and something that takes its place. So it's a volatile and dangerous situation, regardless of how it plays out. Don?
Ben, and let's dig in a little bit more with that, because you have been reporting for years now that the Syrian people had given up hope for any American action. So how do you think they're going to react to this attack?
Well, I think many people will be saying, Don, it's too little, too late, given that more than 400,000 people have been killed in the Syrian civil war so far. It's interesting that there were real high hopes during the administration of Barack Obama that he would do something. After all, it was the Americans who supported the Libyan uprising. They were a bit late in Egypt, but they supported a change of regime there. But in Syria, of course, the administration of Barack Obama found that that was a very hard nut to crack. The Syrian regime was not easily undermined, and of course they had the undying support of the Russians. So I think that people, the sort of people we've been speaking to who witnessed the attack the other day that left so many people killed, that chemical attack, they will be happy to see that the Syrian government pays a price for what it did. But, this is not just a one-off thing. What comes next? Is this something just for the new administration to say, look, we did something? Or is it the beginning of a serious attempt to, as we heard the Secretary of State Tillerson say, to change the regime in Syria? And of course, when you're talking about regime change, and I said it before, who are the other players? Who could replace the regime of Bashar al-Assad? At the moment, the only force strong enough, I'm afraid, is ISIS.
It's ISIS. Listen, and we're going to talk about what that means for ISIS. Is that an opening for ISIS, which many of our experts have been discussing here? But Ben, in a statement tonight, the president spoke about the refugee crisis, saying in part, years of previous attempts at changing Assad's behavior have all failed, and failed very dramatically. As a result, the refugee crisis continues to deepen, and the region continues to destabilize, threatening the United States and its allies. Turkey has taken in a lot of Syrian refugees. What impact do you think this is going to have on the people in that region?
Well, as I said, I think, if this was just one-off thing, 59 cruise missiles fired at Syria, it's not going to make much of a difference. If it's the beginning of some sort of effort to change the regime in Damascus, it will have a huge impact. Now, Turkey, yes, it hosts millions of Syrian refugees at considerable expense. The Turkish government has been pushing for years for the United States to take a stronger position, to take action, to change the regime in Damascus. They certainly, in fact, just yesterday, the Turkish president did say that if any action is to be taken against the regime in Syria, it should be more than just words, and that Turkey will do whatever is needed to help in that effort. Doc?
Ben Wiedemann on the Syria-Turkey border reporting for us. Thank you, Ben.